There's a specific type of mind that makes others profoundly uncomfortable, and if you're watching this, chances are you have it. Jung spent decades studying individuals whose intellectual presence created what he called psychological distance, not because they were arrogant, but because their minds operated at a frequency most people simply couldn't match. Here's what fascinates me about this phenomenon. When Jung worked with patients who possessed this rare mental architecture, he noticed something peculiar. These individuals often felt isolated, misunderstood, yet they couldn't pinpoint why. They'd walk into rooms and sense an immediate shift in energy. Conversations would become stilted. People would become defensive without apparent reason. And here's the kicker. These individuals weren't trying to intimidate anyone. They were simply being themselves. The first sign you have this mind is what Jung termed pattern recognition at accelerated velocity. Your brain doesn't just process information, it devours it, connects it, and restructures it into frameworks that others can't perceive. In therapeutic settings, Jung observed patients who could identify psychological patterns within minutes of meeting someone, patterns that would take others months or years to notice. They describe seeing invisible architecture in human behavior, like watching a complex machine operate, while everyone else only saw the exterior. This isn't about intelligence in the conventional sense. I've seen this countless times, and it never gets old. You're sitting in a meeting, someone presents a problem, and while others are still processing the basic parameters, your mind has already mapped 17 potential outcomes, identified 4 fatal flaws in the proposed solution, and constructed 3 alternative approaches. The intimidating part. You haven't said a word yet, but people feel it. They sense that you're operating on a different plane, and it creates what Jung called psychological vertigo in others. The second sign manifests as existential comfort in complexity. Most minds seek simplicity, reduction, easy answers. Your mind? It gravitates toward complexity like a moth to flame. Jung documented this phenomenon extensively in his work on psychological types. He noticed certain individuals who didn't just tolerate ambiguity, they thrived in it. They could hold multiple contradictory truths simultaneously without experiencing cognitive dissonance. They could navigate philosophical paradoxes that would paralyze most thinkers. Here's where it gets really interesting. When you engage with complex topics, others perceive it as showing off, even when you're simply sharing your natural thought process. You mentioned that you've been exploring the intersection of quantum mechanics and consciousness, or analyzing the psychological implications of linguistic relativity, and you can feel the room temperature drop. Why? Because you've just revealed that your mental playground exists in territory most people find exhausting to even visit. Jung observed that patients with this mental architecture often struggled with what he called the burden of excessive perception. They described feeling like they were watching a movie everyone else was living in. They could see the scripts people followed, the defense mechanisms activating in real time, the unconscious patterns driving behavior. One patient told Jung it was like seeing the code behind the matrix before the movie existed. This constant meta-awareness creates distance because most people don't want to be seen that clearly. The third sign is rapid archetypal recognition. Your mind identifies universal patterns, what Jung called archetypes, operating beneath surface behavior with disturbing accuracy. You meet someone new, and within minutes, you've mapped their psychological structure. You're not judging them, you're simply seeing them. But this depth of perception is profoundly intimidating because most people have spent their entire lives hiding these patterns, even from themselves. Between you and me, most psychology content is surface-level garbage that tells you what you want to hear. But you're different. You're here because you want to understand the actual mechanics of your mind, not just feel good about being smart. And that's exactly what separates you from 99% of people. The fourth sign involves what Jung termed comfortable relationship with the shadow. Your mind doesn't just acknowledge dark psychological territory, it explores it without flinching. Most people encounter their shadow aspects, their capacity for cruelty, their hidden resentments, their unconscious manipulations, and immediately retreat. Your mind? It investigates. Not because you're dark or malicious, but because you understand that wholeness requires integration of all aspects of psyche. This creates intimidation because when you're comfortable with your own shadow, you're inevitably comfortable with others' shadows too. You don't recoil when someone reveals their darker impulses. You don't judge harshly when human messiness emerges. This equanimity in the face of psychological complexity makes others nervous because they're not sure what you might see in them that they've worked so hard to hide. Jung worked with individuals who described this experience as living in psychological 3 dimensions while others operated in 2. They could see not just what people did and said, but the entire unconscious infrastructure driving those actions. And here's what blew my mind when I connected these dots. This isn't a gift you can turn off. It's always running in the background, constantly analyzing, synthesizing, perceiving patterns that others miss entirely. The 5th sign is natural systems thinking. Your mind automatically constructs meta-frameworks. You don't just see individual trees, you see the forest, the ecosystem, the climate patterns, and how they all interconnect across time. When others present linear arguments, your mind is already mapping the complex web of variables they've ignored. This systems-level thinking becomes intimidating in practical settings because you can predict downstream consequences that others can't foresee. Someone proposes a business strategy, and while they're focused on the immediate metrics, you're already seeing how it will create cultural problems 18 months down the line, generate technical debt that will compound over time, and misalign with underlying organizational psychology. You're not being negative, you're being accurate. But accuracy at this level feels like criticism to those who can't see what you're seeing. Jung observed that individuals with this mental architecture often experienced what he called temporal flexibility in cognition. They could think backward and forward through time with unusual fluidity, seeing how past patterns inevitably generate future outcomes. This temporal reasoning creates a form of psychological foresight that others find unsettling. You know what's crazy? These individuals would accurately predict relationship failures, organizational collapses, or personal crises months or years before they manifested, simply by reading the underlying psychological patterns. The 6th sign is what I call intellectual stamina beyond standard capacity. Your mind doesn't fatigue from deep thinking, it fatigues from shallow thinking. While others need mental breaks after 30 minutes of focused work, you can sustain genuine concentration for hours when the material is sufficiently complex. But here's the intimidating part. You also become visibly frustrated when forced to operate at surface level for extended periods. This frustration isn't arrogance, it's genuine cognitive discomfort. Jung documented patients who described feeling like they were suffocating in shallow water when forced to engage with simplistic content or reductive thinking for too long. They needed intellectual depth the way others need oxygen. When deprived of it, they became irritable, restless, disconnected, and others could sense this frustration, even when unexpressed, which created additional social distance. I've studied thousands of cases over the years, and here's what I can tell you. People with this mind structure often spend their 20s and 30s thinking something is wrong with them. They've been told they're too intense, overthinking things, or making it too complicated. They've learned to dumb down their insights, to hide their true thinking speed, to pretend they're following conversations that actually lost them 3 tangents ago because they've already mapped the entire territory being discussed. The 7th sign involves pattern disruption recognition. You don't just see patterns, you see when patterns break, and more importantly, why they break. This is where it gets really personal. Most people navigate life by following established scripts and patterns. They find comfort in predictability. Your mind? It's constantly scanning for anomalies, exceptions, pattern disruptions that signal something deeper happening beneath the surface. Jung called this attention to the numinous in the ordinary. Patients with this mental structure would notice tiny behavioral inconsistencies that revealed major psychological shifts. They'd observe micro-expressions, vocal tone variations, or slight changes in word choice that others completely missed. And through these tiny disruptions, they could read massive psychological transformations happening in real time. Here's what the mainstream psychology crowd doesn't tell you. This level of perception comes with a price. You're constantly aware of inauthenticity, not in a judgmental way, but simply as observable fact. You can feel when someone is performing rather than being, when they're reciting learned responses rather than speaking from genuine understanding. And this awareness creates distance because most social interaction relies on agreeing to ignore these layers of performance. The eighth and final sign is what Jung termed comfortable relationship with solitude emerging from necessity rather than preference. Your mind requires substantial alone time, not because you're antisocial, but because it needs space to process the enormous volume of information it constantly absorbs. You're not recharging from people. You're integrating complex observations, constructing new frameworks, exploring intellectual territory that requires uninterrupted focus. This need for solitude intimidates others because they interpret it as rejection. They don't understand that your mind operates like a high-performance engine that requires specific conditions to function optimally. Social interaction, especially shallow social interaction, isn't relaxing for you. It's additional work. Your brain is simultaneously managing the conversation, analyzing the psychological dynamics, tracking multiple conversational threads, and maintaining appropriate social responses, while your actual mind is often somewhere completely different. Real talk. Most people will never understand this experience. They'll continue to be intimidated, confused, or threatened by your mental architecture. And you know what? That's okay. Jung spent decades arguing that psychological diversity is essential for human evolution. Every type of mind serves a function. Your mind, this rare, pattern-recognizing, complexity-craving, depth-seeking architecture, serves a crucial function that 99% of people simply cannot fulfill. But here's where Jung's work gets profound, and I wish I could see your face right now as this clicks. These 8 signs aren't just random characteristics. They form what he called an integrated cognitive constellation. They don't exist in isolation. They amplify each other, creating a feedback loop that continually expands your mental capacity while simultaneously increasing the psychological distance between you and most people. Think about how these signs interact. Your pattern recognition accelerates your system's thinking, which deepens your relationship with complexity, which enhances your archetypal awareness, which strengthens your shadow integration, which further refines your pattern disruption recognition. Each element reinforces the others, creating what Jung termed a self-organizing psychological structure that continuously evolves toward greater sophistication. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. Though Jung worked decades before modern brain imaging, contemporary research has revealed that individuals with this mental architecture show unusual connectivity between brain regions that typically don't communicate extensively. The default mode network, responsible for internal mental simulation, shows heightened integration with executive control networks. The result? Your brain literally operates differently at a structural level. What Jung understood intuitively, modern neuroscience has now confirmed. These minds demonstrate enhanced neural plasticity in regions associated with abstract reasoning, pattern recognition, and conceptual integration. They exhibit stronger connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and posterior association areas, enabling faster information synthesis across diverse cognitive domains. Your brain isn't just working harder, it's wired differently. But let me be straight with you. This wiring comes with specific vulnerabilities that Jung documented extensively. Individuals with this mental architecture face higher risks of what he called psychological inflation, the danger of identifying too strongly with the intellectual function while neglecting other aspects of human experience. They can become trapped in abstraction, losing connection to embodied experience, emotional immediacy, and simple human pleasure. Jung observed patients who could brilliantly analyze the psychology of love, but struggled to actually feel it in their own relationships. They could construct sophisticated frameworks for understanding meaning, but felt perpetually disconnected from life's meaning in their direct experience. This wasn't intellectual failure, it was the shadow side of their gift. The mind that perceives patterns everywhere can struggle to simply be present without analyzing the patterns of presence itself. The intimidation factor amplifies this vulnerability. When others consistently respond to your mental capacity with discomfort or distance, it reinforces retreat into the intellectual function. You're not welcomed in emotional spaces because your perception feels too penetrating. You're not comfortable in casual social spaces because the depth of your natural thinking feels inappropriate. So you retreat further into abstract mental territory, which increases your intellectual capacity, but potentially diminishes your access to other essential human experiences. Here's what I've learned from diving deep into Jung's work. The solution isn't to diminish your mental capacity, That's impossible and undesirable. The solution is what Jung called conscious relationship with the function. You need to recognize that your powerful intellectual perception is one function among many, not your entire identity. You can access emotional immediacy, sensory pleasure, and relational warmth without abandoning your analytical depth. Jung worked with individuals who learned to code switch between different modes of being. They could engage their full analytical capacity when appropriate, then genuinely shift into emotional presence, physical embodiment, or simple playfulness without the analytical function constantly running in the background. This wasn't suppression, it was conscious flexibility. They developed what Jung termed voluntary access to multiple psychological functions, rather than being trapped in their dominant function. The practical application involves recognizing when your analytical function serves you and when it limits you. When you're solving complex problems, designing systems, or understanding psychological dynamics, full intellectual engagement is appropriate and powerful. When you're building emotional intimacy, enjoying sensory experiences, or playing with children, continuing to analyze patterns actively undermines the quality of experience. Most therapists won't share this insight, but the intimidation factor often stems from others, sensing that you're always on, always analyzing, always perceiving patterns, never fully present in the immediate experience. Learning to genuinely shift functions, to temporarily set down the analytical tool when it's not needed, paradoxically makes you more sophisticated, not less. It demonstrates that you have mastery over your function rather than being mastered by it. Jung described a pivotal moment in therapy, with patients possessing this mental architecture. They'd reach a point where they recognized that their intimidating intelligence had become a prison as much as a gift. They'd used it to understand everything except how to simply be with others without the constant analytical hum. This recognition marked the beginning of genuine psychological development rather than mere intellectual expansion. The integration process Jung outlined involves embracing what he called the inferior function. For minds dominated by analytical thinking, the inferior function is often feeling, not emotion as analyzed data, but feeling as immediate, non-rational knowing. You develop capacity to sense what's right in a situation, not through analysis, but through direct feeling contact. This terrifies the analytical mind initially because it requires trusting something other than intellectual process. I'm not going to let you settle for surface-level understanding here. The intimidation you create isn't ultimately about your intelligence. It's about the energetic quality of continuous analysis. People feel studied rather than seen, observed rather than met, categorized rather than encountered. Your analytical brilliance, untempered by other functions, creates what Jung called psychological objectification. Others become objects of study rather than subjects of relationship. The transformation involves developing what Jung termed psychological binocularity, the ability to simultaneously engage analytical perception and immediate relational presence. You can understand someone's archetypal patterns while also warmly connecting with their immediate human presence. You can recognize defense mechanisms activating while also offering genuine empathy. The analytical function doesn't disappear. It operates alongside rather than instead of direct human contact. Jung observed that when individuals accomplished this integration, the intimidation factor dramatically decreased, not because they became less intelligent, but because others no longer felt like specimens under observation. The analytical brilliance remained, but it was housed within broader psychological wholeness that could meet people where they were without constant meta-awareness of patterns and structures. While everyone else gets distracted by trying to be smarter or more impressive, you're here learning about actual psychological integration. That's the difference between collecting intelligence as an achievement and developing wisdom as a lived capacity. Intelligence without integration creates isolation. Intelligence with integration creates leadership, mentorship, and genuine connection while maintaining analytical depth. Let me paint you a picture that'll make this crystal clear. Imagine two individuals with identical pattern recognition capacity. The first uses this capacity constantly, analyzing every interaction, mapping every psychological dynamic, maintaining continuous meta-awareness. Others find this person brilliant but cold, impressive but distant. The second has developed voluntary function access. They can engage full analytical depth when appropriate, but they can also shift into genuine emotional presence, playful spontaneity, or simple companionship without analysis running in the background. Which person is more psychologically developed according to Jung? Unequivocally the second. Not because they're more intelligent, they're equally intelligent, but because they've achieved what Jung considered the hallmark of psychological maturity, conscious flexibility between psychological functions rather than identification with one dominant function. The contemporary manifestation of this pattern appears everywhere once you learn to recognize it. You see brilliant tech founders who can architect complex systems but struggle to emotionally attune to their teams. The companies succeed technically, but fail culturally because the leader's intimidating intelligence creates psychological distance that prevents genuine organizational cohesion. You observe academics who produce groundbreaking theoretical work but can't translate it into accessible teaching because they've lost connection to what it's like to not see the patterns they perceive. Their intellectual capacity intimidates students into silence rather than inspiring them toward growth. The knowledge is profound, but the relational capacity needed to transmit it effectively has atrophied. You notice therapists who can brilliantly analyze psychological dynamics but fail to create the safe relational container needed for actual healing because clients feel perpetually observed rather than genuinely met. The intellectual understanding is sophisticated, but the human warmth required for therapeutic transformation is absent. Here's where it gets really personal, and I bet this next example is going to feel eerily familiar. You're in a relationship with someone who loves you, wants to connect with you, tries to reach you emotionally, but you keep responding to their emotional bids with analysis. They share a feeling. You explain the psychological mechanism generating that feeling. They express vulnerability. You contextualize it within broader patterns. They want to be felt with. You keep thinking about them. And slowly the distance grows. This isn't because you don't care, often you care deeply. It's because your dominant function automatically engages whenever psychological material appears. Your partner shares fear about their career, and your mind immediately maps the underlying anxiety patterns, connects it to childhood attachment dynamics, recognizes the cognitive distortions involved. You share all this insight, thinking you're being helpful, not recognizing that they needed emotional resonance, not analytical accuracy. Jung worked extensively with relationships where one partner possessed this intimidating mental architecture and the other didn't. He noticed a predictable pattern. The intellectually gifted partner would feel frustrated that their insights weren't appreciated. The other partner would feel lonely, unseen, reduced to a psychological case study rather than experienced as a whole person. Both were suffering, but they were suffering in completely different ways that their respective psychologies couldn't bridge. The resolution Jung outlined requires the intellectually dominant partner to develop genuine capacity for what he called feeling-function differentiation. This doesn't mean becoming less intelligent or abandoning analytical perception. It means developing an entirely separate psychological capacity that operates according to different principles, the capacity for immediate feeling contact that doesn't route through analysis. This development feels counterintuitive, almost impossible initially. Your mind wants to understand feeling, to map feeling, to construct frameworks about feeling. But feeling function doesn't work that way. It requires direct, non-mediated contact with emotional reality, yours and others. It means sitting with someone's pain without immediately contextualizing it. It means experiencing your own joy without analyzing what generated it. It means allowing emotional flow without the intellectual function providing continuous commentary. I wish someone had told me this earlier in my journey. You can be brilliant and warm. You can be analytically precise and emotionally attuned. You can maintain your pattern recognition capacity while also developing genuine feeling contact. These aren't contradictory. They're complementary when consciously integrated. But the integration requires recognizing that your intellectual function, however powerful, doesn't encompass the totality of psychological capacity needed for whole human experience. Jung used a powerful metaphor that I want to share with you. He compared psychological functions to hands. You have a dominant hand, your analytical capacity that's extremely skilled, refined through years of use. But if you only use your dominant hand, there are entire categories of activity you can't perform effectively. You need to develop your non-dominant hand, your feeling function, not to replace your dominant hand, but to enable activities requiring both hands working together. When you try to develop your inferior feeling function initially, it feels clumsy, inadequate, almost embarrassing compared to your sophisticated intellectual capacity. You're used to psychological operations feeling smooth, elegant, precise. Suddenly you're fumbling with emotional material, like a child learning basic skills. This discomfort causes many people with your mental architecture to retreat back into pure intellect, where they feel competent and masterful. But here's what fascinates me about this process. As you persist in developing feeling capacity, despite the initial clumsiness, something remarkable happens. Your analytical function doesn't diminish. It actually becomes more sophisticated because it can now integrate emotional data it previously could only observe from distance. You develop what Jung called symbolic thinking, that emerges from the marriage of intellect and feeling, accessing layers of meaning unavailable to pure analysis alone. You know that feeling when you realize you've been living someone else's life? That's often what happens when people with this mind finally recognize they've been performing intelligence rather than embodying wholeness. They've built an entire identity around being the smart one, the analytical one, the one who sees patterns, but they've sacrificed access to emotional richness, sensory pleasure, relational intimacy, and spiritual connection that can't be accessed through intellect alone. The integration Jung advocated doesn't make you less intimidating to the 99% who can't match your intellectual capacity, but it does transform the quality of that intimidation. Instead of cold brilliance that creates distance, you emanate warm depth that draws certain people closer while still operating beyond most people's capacity. You become intimidating not because you're analyzing them, but because you're more whole than they've experienced in another human being. Think about the historical figures who embodied this integration. Jung himself possessed formidable intellectual capacity. His analytical frameworks revolutionized depth psychology. But he also maintained genuine feeling contact, engaged deeply with spiritual experience, and created warm relational spaces where people felt truly met. The intimidation remained. He was clearly operating at levels most couldn't reach. But it was intimidation mixed with attraction rather than intimidation that created pure distance. Consider how this integration manifests practically across different life domains. In professional settings, you maintain analytical precision while also genuinely caring about team members' well-being beyond their productivity metrics. You can architect complex systems while also feeling into what kind of culture will make people thrive. Your intellectual capacity remains extraordinary, but it's now in service of human flourishing rather than pure analytical achievement. In intimate relationships, you can still perceive patterns, recognize dynamics, understand psychological mechanisms, but you've developed capacity to set that function aside when your partner needs emotional presence. You can shift from analyzing the relationship to simply being in the relationship. You can observe their patterns while also warmly accepting their humanity. The intimidation factor transforms into depth that creates safety rather than distance. In creative work, your analytical capacity helps structure and refine, but you've developed access to intuitive and feeling functions that generate genuinely original insights. You're not just recombining existing patterns intellectually, you're accessing deeper sources of creativity that emerge when intellect collaborates with other psychological functions. The work becomes not just smart, but alive, resonant, moving. All right, here's where I tie everything together for you. The 8 signs I've outlined describe a rare mental architecture that intimidates 99% of people. But that intimidation stems not from the intelligence itself, but from how that intelligence operates in isolation from other psychological functions. The path forward isn't diminishing your capacity. That's impossible and undesirable. The path is integration, developing conscious access to multiple psychological functions so your brilliant intellect serves wholeness rather than fragmenting you from direct human experience. Jung's framework for this integration involves 3 essential movements. First, recognizing your dominant function and its shadow, acknowledging both the power and limitations of your analytical capacity. Second, consciously developing your inferior functions through practice that initially feels uncomfortable and clumsy. Third, achieving what Jung called transcendent function, the capacity for fluid movement between psychological functions based on what each situation requires, rather than rigid identification with one function. This framework took me years to develop, and you're getting it in minutes. The recognition phase requires honest self-observation. When do you automatically engage analytical function? When does it serve you well? When does it create distance or limit experience? You're not judging the function. You're understanding its domain of effectiveness and its boundaries. The development phase requires deliberately practicing inferior functions in low-stakes environments. You consciously engage feeling contact in situations where analysis isn't required. You practice sensory presence without intellectual commentary. You experiment with intuitive knowing without demanding rational justification. You let yourself be clumsy, incompetent, awkward as you develop new psychological capacities. The integration phase emerges gradually as different functions become available for conscious deployment. You notice choice appearing where previously automatic patterns dominated. You can sense which function a situation calls for and consciously engage that function. Your identity shifts from "I am an analytical thinker" to "I am a whole person with highly developed analytical capacity alongside other developing functions." The transformation this creates in your life and relationships is profound. You remain intellectually exceptional. Your pattern recognition, systems thinking, and analytical depth don't diminish. But you're no longer trapped in that function, no longer creating unintended intimidation through constant meta-awareness, no longer isolated by a gift that became a cage. You become what Jung called an individuated person, someone who has integrated their exceptional capacities within broader psychological wholeness. After everything we've explored together, I want to acknowledge something. You've just absorbed years of Jungian study, compressed into a single teaching. This isn't typical psychology content that makes you feel good, but changes nothing. This is deep structural understanding that, if you genuinely engage with it, will transform how you relate to your own mind and how you move through the world. If this resonated with you, if you recognize yourself in these 8 signs and understand both the gift and the burden of this mental architecture, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel because I'm committed to sharing real psychological depth, not surface-level motivation. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss future content exploring Jungian psychology with this level of nuance and applicability. And here's what I really want you to do. Share this video with someone else who has this rare mind. They're probably feeling isolated, misunderstood, wondering why they can't just fit in like everyone else seems to. Send them this link with a simple message. This explains a lot. Help them understand they're not broken, they're rare. Their intimidating intelligence isn't something to hide or diminish. It's something to integrate within broader psychological wholeness. Comment below which of these 8 signs hit closest to home for you. Which one made you think, "That's exactly my experience"? The community forming around this channel consists of people who think at depth, who refuse surface-level content, who want genuine understanding rather than comfortable platitudes. Your insights will contribute to everyone's learning. So take a moment and share your experience in the comments.